Hi, it's Miss Bastido. We are going to cover in this video, it's the second part of functioning ecosystems. It'll go through nutrient cycles, keystone species, and the ecological niche concept. So we'll start with the water cycle. You've probably learned about this before, so we're just going to go over the basic parts that you'll need to know for this course. So the first part is evaporation. So we know that water, it can evaporate from the ocean, it can evaporate from fresh water, and it can also evaporate from the ground. That's water going from the liquid phase to the gaseous phase. And I'm sure all of you have already gone through that before and know that. Once it goes into the gaseous phase, it will then condense, going from gas to liquid, and then from there it will go and turn into precipitation, which can then fall anywhere on land or in the ocean. Once it hits the land, we could have surface runoff, or it could infiltrate into the ground. And depending on the soil quality, the soil might be able to retain some of that water for longer. If not, it will end up running off into a body of water, whether it be a creek or an ocean or a lake or something like that. Another concept you need to know is transpiration. So transpiration is similar to evaporation, except for it's coming directly from the leaves. So when you look at a leaf, on the underside of the leaf, if you were to look at it under the microscope, there are small tiny holes called stomata, and those holes will evaporate water when they open. Their function mostly is to exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen through those holes, but in doing that, they also lose some water. And then, as we already said, surface runoff was another one that you should probably know for this part of the water cycle, that water then runs off into another, from land into another body of water. So moving on to the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle is really mostly about photosynthesis and cellular respiration, and then the rest is mostly about human activities. So photosynthesis, as you recall from Unit 1, is when carbon dioxide is taken in, and the plant then does photosynthesis through the light-dependent reaction and the light-independent reaction to make sugar. And so carbon dioxide, photosynthesis is the main way that carbon dioxide can be taken out of the atmosphere. Cellular respiration, on the other hand, which plants, animals, fungus, bacteria, everybody does cellular respiration, releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so by eating whatever you're eating, whether it be a plant or an animal, your body, in order to get the ATP energy out, will then go through a process of cellular respiration in the mitochondria and release a byproduct of that is carbon dioxide, and we end up breathing that carbon dioxide out. That goes out into the atmosphere. A human activity that affects the carbon cycle would be the burning or combustion of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels are formed from dead organic matter that through heat and pressure get built up over millions of years, and store really high amounts of carbon. And that carbon can be burned as an energy source, but in doing that, we release a lot of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Deforestation, and I didn't put this on there, but also forest fires, both of those are going to put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. There's a lot of carbon in trees, and so as we deforest land, we're then putting the carbon back into the atmosphere. We're also reducing the soil quality, and soil is another sink for carbon. And so if the soil doesn't have enough microbes and things like that in it, then it's going to release more carbon as well. So deforestation, forest fires, all of those are going to put more carbon into the atmosphere. Another way that carbon can be taken in is through the ocean. So carbon dioxide can dissolve into the water. It can also be taken in by photosynthetic organisms in the ocean, but the part about it, just the ocean uptaking it, would be mostly it dissolving into the ocean. Now, the warmer the oceans get, the less likely they are to be able to dissolve CO2. And so this creates like a positive feedback loop, because the warmer they get, the less CO2 they can absorb, which means there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, which likely means that the oceans are getting warmer. And that's the whole idea of behind climate change. You don't need to know a lot about climate change for this, but understanding the human impacts on this cycle is really important. And lastly, we keep talking about the atmosphere, but the atmosphere, CO2 in the atmosphere, it is a greenhouse gas. And so you can think of it as a blanket around the Earth, keeping the Earth warm, and that's a good thing, except for when we have too much CO2 in the atmosphere, we now have a really thick blanket. And so the Earth is warming, causing all sorts of issues in terms of sea level rise and warmer temperatures and bigger cyclones and things like that. The nitrogen cycle is likely one that you haven't really spent too much time on before this class. So just spending a little bit of time on that. So 78% of the atmosphere is made up of nitrogen gas, which is N2. Nitrogen gas is not a usable form for living organisms. So like a plant can't take in nitrogen gas and use it, neither can animals. And so we need nitrogen to make proteins. They're found in amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. And we also need a bit of nitrogen for DNA as well to make DNA. And so we have these soil organisms here. You can see there's actually a few different kinds, but we have these bacteria that live on the root nodules of a lot of plants, specifically legumes. And so those nitrogen fixing bacteria and some fungus that's in there as well that helps, but the bacteria itself is what's going to, we say, do nitrogen fixation. And so nitrogen fixation is converting nitrogen gas into a usable form that the plant can use, such as nitrate. Then there's other soil bacteria that convert nitrogen gas into ammonium, and that process is called ammonification. Ammonia cannot be taken in by plants either, so there are other bacteria that then take the ammonium and convert it into nitrites, and then even more bacteria that will then convert these nitrites, which is NO2 negative, into nitrates, which is NO3 negative. You don't necessarily need to know the chemical formula for them, but it's nice to understand why these are all different. Just slightly different nitrogen compounds that needs to be in a usable form that the plant can take in. So then the nitrates can then be taken in. If they haven't been done here, they can be taken in through this longer process from plants. And we call that process assimilation. And that's them just being able to take in the nitrates and use it for building proteins in the plant. Sometimes the plant will obviously die. It breaks down by the decomposers, which are different bacteria in the soil, and those decomposers release ammonium, and then it kind of goes back into this cycle. The last thing that could happen is these nitrates. There are other bacteria that are called denitrifying bacteria, and they do denitrification, which is converting the nitrates back to nitrogen gas and releasing it into the atmosphere. So you can see how this process is a bit more complex than some of the other cycles, and it's not really too hard to learn. You don't have to know all of the chemical formulas, but if you can just understand that plants can't take in nitrogen gas, that they need these nitrogen fixing bacteria to create nitrates that they can assimilate and use to make proteins. So moving on from those nutrient cycles, we want to talk about the ecological niche. So a niche is, you think of like it's the job of an organism. It's everything about them. It's their habitat, so where they live, it's what they eat, their feeding, and then all of their interactions. Those could be symbiotic interactions, those could be predation, any kind of interaction that they might have with other organisms. So if we gave the example of the kookaburra, their niche, if we were using sort of this idea of their habitat is, move myself so you can see that a bit better. Habitat is open forest and woodlands in East and Southwest Australia. So I know we have these on my farm where I live, and so you've probably seen these guys around. Their niche, part of their niche is what they eat. So they eat insects, mice, small reptiles, and they don't drink water actually. So they get all their water from the food that they eat. And then the last part is their interaction. So they're diurnal, meaning that they are out during the day. They're pretty territorial, so you'll find them in the same place. I know on my farm, we find them sort of right in that same area every day. They don't seem to move around too much. And they have extended parental care. And they also have a mate for life. And so they choose one mate, and that's their mate for life. And so with the niche concept, there is a fundamental and a realized niche. So the fundamental niche is the niche that they could occupy if it wasn't for competition. And so here, because of competition, their realized niche is a bit smaller than their actual fundamental niche. And understanding that is going to lead us to another principle called the competitive exclusion principle. So with the competitive exclusion principle, what's happened here is that these are some barnacles. There's brown ones and blue ones. They actually weren't blue, I'm sure. This is just in the diagram. But what Joseph Cannell did was he noticed that one species of barnacle was only found in this section, and the other species of barnacle was found sort of deeper in the lower strata there where the tide was. And so he removed the blue barnacles here to see what these sort of brown ones would do. And what he found was that when these were removed, that the brown ones then occupied their fundamental niche and went quite deeper than they did before. And so because of competition, they have, to reduce their competition, essentially, they're only occupying this niche up here. But if this species is not present, they will expand all the way down. And so this is called the competitive exclusion principle, which really just means that no two species can occupy the same niche at the same time. And if they do, one of them will end up competing and outcompeting the other, and one will likely go extinct unless they change their niche. And so species automatically try to reduce their competition as much as possible. And so this is an example of that. Because of this, and that was the same with the barnacles, that species do niche partitioning. So here on this tree, you have 3 species of warblers. These warblers they feed on different things within the tree. And so the Cape May warbler here feeds at the tip of the branches, and this one is then in the middle, and this one is here at the bottom. And so if this yellow-rumped warbler attempted to occupy in the middle, they likely wouldn't compete as well because of what they eat. And so if they would have too much competition here, and one of the species would end up going extinct because the rest of their niche is so similar. And so the way that they've partitioned their niche is that they each live in a different part of the tree. So on to another concept of keystone species. We've talked about this a bit before, but keystone species are really important for the proper functioning of ecosystems. It is not always the largest. It is not always the most abundant species. It is a lot of times a predator and a top-down approach, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. If we remove a keystone species from an ecosystem, it oftentimes changes the whole ecosystem, not just a small portion. And so here are a few examples, or here's an example of a keystone species in northern Queensland. Their importance, the reason that they're so important is they eat and spread a fungus called truffles. And these truffles are really necessary for plants in the forest. And obviously so many other species depend on the plants. And so without this species, this fungus can't be spread, and that reduces the nutrients for the plants, which reduces their growth, which then will affect any other organism feeding on the plants or then feeding on those organisms. Hopefully that was helpful to you. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know, and I hopefully can answer those for you. There are a lot of other examples of keystone species in Queensland, and so I encourage you to find out what those are. I know in my class, we will be doing a bit of research in class on those. I hope this video was helpful to you, and I'll see you next time.